Welcome to the Saturday, March 15th, 2025 edition of Promethean Actions Weekly Class Series. Tonight is called A World of Sovereign Nation States. And I'd like to begin by showing you the last 5 minutes of President Trump's address to the United Nations in 2018 during his first term, which was precisely on this question of a world of sovereign nation states. So you'll see how he sees it.
It is the question of what kind of world will we leave for our children, and what kind of nations they will inherit. The dreams that fill this hall today are as diverse as the people who have stood at this podium, and as varied as the countries represented right here in this body are. It really is something. It really is great, great history. There is India, a free society, over 1 billion people, successfully lifting countless millions out of poverty and into the middle class. There is Saudi Arabia, where King Solen and the Crown Prince are pursuing bold new reforms. There is Israel, proudly celebrating its 70th anniversary as a thriving democracy in the Holy Land. In Poland, the great people are standing up for their independence, their security, and their sovereignty. Many countries are pursuing their own unique visions, building their own hopeful futures, and chasing their own wonderful dreams of destiny, of legacy, and of a home. The whole world is richer. Humanity is better because of this beautiful constellation of nations, each very special, each very unique, and each shining brightly in its part of the world. In each one, we see awesome promise of a people bound together by a shared past and working toward a common future. As for Americans, we know what kind of future we want for ourselves. We know what kind of a nation America must always be. In America, we believe in the majesty of freedom and the dignity of the individual. We believe in self-government and the rule of law, and we prize the culture that sustains our liberty, a culture built on strong families, deep faith, and fierce independence. We celebrate our heroes. We treasure our traditions. And above all, we love our country. Inside everyone in this great chamber today, and everyone listening all around the globe, there is the heart of a patriot that feels the same powerful love for your nation, the same intense loyalty to your homeland. The passion that burns in the hearts of patriots and the souls of nations has inspired reform and revolution, sacrifice and selflessness, scientific breakthroughs, and magnificent works of art. Our task is not to erase it, but to embrace it, to build with it, to draw on its ancient wisdom, and to find within it the will to make our nations greater, our region safer, and the world better. To unleash this incredible potential in our people, we must defend the foundations that make it all possible. Sovereign and independent nations are the only vehicle where freedom has ever survived, democracy has ever endured, where peace has ever prospered. And so we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all. When we do, we will find new avenues for cooperation unfolding before us. We will find new passion for peacemaking rising within us. We will find new purpose, new resolve, and new spirit flourishing all around us and making this a more beautiful world in which to live. So together, let us choose a future of patriotism, prosperity, and pride. Let us choose peace and freedom over domination and defeat. And let us come here to this place to stand for our people and their nations, forever strong, forever sovereign, forever just, and forever thankful for the grace and the goodness and the glory of God. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the nations of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the United States of America for the statement just made.
So, in the few minutes of this class, I'm going to try to give some notion of how this concept of the sovereign nation-state republic or the Commonwealth has developed over history, and also in the more recent period, the 19th and 20th centuries, the notion which President Trump laid out there of a world of sovereign nation states, which, as I say, this will be a far better world than any which humanity has seen in its known history. Now, let me just show quickly a chronology. Clearly, I'm not going to be able to go into any depth on all of this, but it does cover some of the major developments as I see them. Solen of Athens, his reforms in 600 BC, which prevented the destruction of Athens and began Athens as a city-state Commonwealth Republic, which it became. Plato, 400 BC, his ideas, which are the basis of the sovereign state, but ideas which were totally redrafted and reframed by Jesus Christ and his apostles into a form which could be assimilated by millions of people and were assimilated by millions of people, creation of a wholly new thing, which was Christian society. Joan of Arc, 1412, who lived merely 19 years, from 1412 to 1431, and played a huge role, an indispensable role, in creating the first modern nation state in France under Louis XI, who reigned from 1461 to 83. Henry VII of England, who had been a refugee in France, returned to England to fight in the extension of the Wars of the Roses and become monarch 1485 to 1509, again beginning the Commonwealth principle or the Republic in England, from which our own is descended in a sense. The Pilgrims landed here in 1620, the Massachusetts misspelled, but the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1628. English people also quite profoundly influenced by Holland and their stay in Holland and the Christian movement in Holland. The founding of the USSA, 1776 to 91. John Quincy Adams' Monroe Doctrine, which was a statement of a agreement of principle among independent sovereign nations. And this is, again, the background to what President Trump said at the UN in 2018. The Lincoln presidency, called by many the Second American Revolution, and particularly in view of President Trump's relations with Mexico and with Mexico's President Sheinbaum today, we can look back to Lincoln's relationship to Mexico's President Benito Juarez in a period when Mexico was fighting off the French colonialists under Napoleon III with American support. James G. Blaine, the man from Maine, a congressman, a senator, and a secretary of state from 1863 to 92, with his fight for reciprocity, which President Trump is fighting for now, and for a hemispheric policy, which was also that of President McKinley, which foreshadowed Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy of 1933, good neighbor policy of his entire administration. But that good neighbor policy of, again, a community of sovereign nations with Central and South America foreshadowed the steps he was taking when he died to try to ensure that the world after World War II would be a world of sovereign nation states without colonialism. He insisted on the freeing of the British, Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies. Unfortunately, he was killed, and that's not what happened. Now let's go back to 600 BC. In 600 BC, Athens was at the brink of a terrible fratricidal civil war. The class of poor farmers was being foreclosed on, but the mortgages which they were subject to involved the security of the body. That is, if the farmer finally defaulted on the mortgage, after his farm was taken from him, his body was taken from him in the sense that he was kidnapped into slavery, usually sent to foreign parts as a slave so that his friends and relatives couldn't protect him. So the poor farmers were being sent into slavery. The landed laborers were being thrown off the land. And the prospect was for a disastrous civil war when Solen, of an aristocratic family, but a man without any money who was engaged in trade, international trade to support himself, Solen was called in as a lawmaker to make binding law for Athens, because he was the only man, given who he was in his history, and his reputation, his honesty, his forthrightness. He was the only person, and the fact that he was an aristocrat but had no money, he was the only person whom all the factions could trust to do that. Now, Solen was not only a lawmaker and a merchant, but he was also a poet. And it's an unusual privilege with a great statesman like this to be able to read his poetry and see how in his inmost self he understood the reforms which he was enacting. to save the city and create a commonwealth. So this is a translation of a fragment. Unfortunately, only fragments of Solen's poetry survive. This is a translation of a fragment of a Solen poem by a well-known translator. Unfortunately, it's a bit difficult, but bear with me, and I think you'll learn from it. He says, before achieving what of the goals for which I brought the people together did I stop? In other words, did I stop before I completed my task? In the verdict of time, I will have as my best witness the mighty mother of the Olympian gods, the earth, whose boundary markers I once removed. Enslaved before, now she is free. These stone boundary markers were the markers of the mortgages on the Athenian farms, basically the poor farms in the hilly regions, not in the hilly regions of the north, not the good farms of the nobles. So Solen is saying he removed the boundary markers of mortgage that signified the mortgage, freeing the earth from her slavery, he said. And I brought back to Athens, to their homeland founded by the gods, many who had been sold, one legally, another not, and those who had fled under necessity's constraint, no longer even speaking the Attic language, as wanderers inclined to do. What he did, then this was perhaps his most important reform. It's called the Sisaktheia, or the shaking off of burdens. He canceled all debts, public and private, including the mortgage debts. And he canceled the slavery, which the poor farmers had been sent into, and brought them back to their farms in freedom. And those who suffered shameful slavery right here in Athens, trembling before the whims of their masters, I set free. These things I did by the exercise of my power, binding together force and justice, and I persevered to the end as I promised. I wrote laws for the lower and upper classes alike, providing a straight legal process for each person. The Athens had previously been ruled by an aristocracy, hereditary aristocracy, and Solen ended the legal distinctions of hereditary aristocrats. They no longer existed. Instead, he did a 5-part division of the population by their income, which, if you think that these were basically farmers, their income is the proceeds of their lands for the most part. A 5-part division by their income, which also governed what they had to provide for the state. For instance, the class of knights were people who had the income to provide horses, cavalry for the state, and so on. So by their obligations for the state, which were dictated by their income, in effect, he had a new division of Athenian society. So they were not equal in their ability to hold office or vote for office. They were divided by this stratification, but the difference, as Solen said in another poem, which I don't have a translation here, the difference is that the rule of these hereditary families as such was over, because wealth appears in one generation, not in another. So one person will be in the upper property class, his children or grandchildren perhaps in the lower. He said, if another had taken up the goad as I did, if another had taken up this task as I did, he would not have restrained the masses. For if I had been willing to do what was pleasing to their opponents, in turn, whatever the masses planned for them, if I had taken sides, with the masses or the rich, the city would have been bereft of many men. There would have been civil war and many deaths. For that reason, I set up a defense on every side and turned about like a wolf among a pack of dogs. I hope that gives some idea of, what he did and how he saw his reforms in Athens, which, new laws were added. I mean, the character of Athenian society changed, but it's Solen's reforms set it, on a path of the Republic, the Commonwealth, even if not the same as ours or those in modern times. The now the next step in this journey is Plato, and the the but the ideas, the political ideas of Plato, as I said before in very brief, the political ideas of Plato had to be uh, recreated by Jesus Christ and his apostles, who were Greek-speaking Jews embedded in Hellenistic culture in the Hellenistic world of the Mediterranean. So the Platonic idea of logos or reason becomes in Christianity the word, where many of you know the word in the Bible is logos, becomes what's called the word in the Gospel of John. The word has become flesh. The Plato's concept of agape or platonic love becomes charity in our King James version of the Bible, to translate the Latin caritas, which is just a translation of the Greek agape in the original of St. John. And the most important concept, perhaps, what Plato calls, perhaps he calls it other things, but what I've found Plato call something divine in the soul, becomes in the Christian world. Of course, this is not only Christian, this is in the Old Testament. Man in the living image of God, or man in the image and likeness of God. So from there, I want to go to France in the 15th century, to Joan of Arc, a story which, a story which to hear it is to virtually disbelieve it. That a 17-year-old illiterate girl could lead the armies of a kingdom to victory in a war which they had lost. And to do this under the instruction of angels, as she insisted. This strains credulity, and probably many people, and many of you on this call, think that this is mere myth, and nothing like this could ever happen. But as Mark Twain pointed out, and many others have, Mark Twain wrote a wonderful book, very factual book, about Joan of Arc around 1895, called Personal Reminiscences of Joan of Arc. What he pointed out there, and others have since, is that the life of Joan of Arc, short as it is, she was burned alive to death at the age of 19. But short of that life it was more thoroughly documented than perhaps any life in history. I mean, because of the two trials of Joan of Arc, the one which condemned her to be burned to death, and the one which, few decades later, um, um, exonerated her. Both trials under the rules of the church, with sworn notarized testimony by numerous witnesses, firsthand witnesses of the events. I mean, what Twain pointed out is that, and others have, that Joan of Arc's life was more thoroughly documented than any life in history. So I mean, in this documented story, an illiterate peasant girl of very sound character and piety and courage was visited repeatedly by the archangel Michael and other angels who told her she had to rescue France from occupation by the English and the Burgundians and recapture the town of Reims, Rheims, so that the King Charles VII could be crowned their King of France. She talked her way into the royal court, and in order to demand from, or ask, whatever you want to say, to demand or ask from the king that he assign her a body of troops to lift the siege of Orleans, one of the greatest French cities, which was being choked out under a siege by the English and the Burgundians. Eventually she was admitted to the court, but the king tried to make her prove her divine mission, if you like, by hiding himself among the courtiers in regular clothes, and telling his court to pay no attention to him, so that Joan would enter the court and presumably not be able to find the king. But rather than not find him, she walked directly up to him, knelt, and said, "God give you long life, noble king." To which he said, "I'm not the king." And she answered, "In God's name you are. Give me troops to relieve Orleans and take you to Reims to be crowned. It is the will of God." So after that, the king had to meet with her. He met with her privately, and she convinced him by giving him a sign, which the sign was that in his despair at being deprived of his crown, and not only deprived of his crown, but as part of the struggle, his own mother tried to convince him and others that he was a bastard and not really the royal heir. So in despair, the king had knelt in silent prayer and made a prayer which he would never tell anyone for shame. But Joan told him what he had prayed and when. So Joan was sent to town, to Poitiers, to be examined by learned theologians to assure the king that what she called, or what she said were heavenly revelations, didn't come from the devil. So in Poitiers, you had a number of professors. Some of them had fled from the University of Paris, which was under Burgundian occupation, and fled as despised patriots to Poitiers in the area of the court of Charles. When the king said this to Joan, she said, "Well, I don't want to be examined in theology. I want to be examined in artillery, in how to place artillery." And indeed, she was a master in artillery, and nobody could position artillery as well as she could. So, and nevertheless, she went to be examined by the theologians. The story which Mark Twain and many others tell is that one of the theologians was from Limoges, where the French say the people in Limoges have terrible French. So attempting to twist her up or whatever, who knows? This theologian, Seguin, asked her, in what language did the angel speak to you? And she answered, better French than yours. Uh, so the, I mean, an aspect of this intersects many other aspects of this story. I mean, the great French theologian Jean Gerson was also in exile from Paris at this point, although not in Poitiers. And so he was not present for this examination, but he's widely credited with the result, which was that the theologian said she was a pious person, and she was not being organized by the devil. Gerson was widely credited with that result because of a book he had written on true and false revelations, which was probably used in the trial, and because 2 years later, roughly, he wrote a paper verifying Joan's revelations and her divine mission, and then shortly after he died. Gerson was akin to the tendency which developed in the Netherlands at that time, called the Devotio Moderna, however you want to say it, which was more or less the same thing as the Brothers of the Common Life, which educated Erasmus, which produced the book, The Imitation of Christ, and which profoundly influenced our colonists to New England in their stay in the Netherlands, and more than that. So Joan did proceed to Orleans. She rallied the dispirited troops, and she overcame the siege and expelled the English. And she went on, as she said, to recapture Reims, Reims, with its cathedral, where the kings of France had always been crowned. So Joan played a critical role in the creation of the French nation, the modern French nation, which gave us the first nation state known in history, shortly after Joan's martyrdom, and which meant so much to the United States, not only in the concrete support the French gave us in our revolution, but in the example of the French institutions, the influence of Colbert's French economy on our notions of economy, on Hamilton, on the American system of economy. It's a very direct tradition from France. But Charles the Seventh, whom Joan had crowned, betrayed her to the English. She was put on trial by an inquisition. She was condemned to be burnt alive, and was burnt alive at roughly the age of 19. Her ashes were thrown into the river, but from those ashes arose the Commonwealth under Louis XI, who had actually met Joan as a young man. And from the French Commonwealth of Louis XI came the British Commonwealth of Henry VII, who had been an exile in France, returned to England, defeated Richard III, as you know from Shakespeare, and ruled England 1485 to 1509. Again, as a commonwealth devoted to the general welfare. The um, the I mean, from there, let me jump to American presidents. And I mean, here I'm talking about, more directly what President Trump said at the United Nations. The mission of the United States for a world governed by sovereign nation state republics. And I mean, in that regard, I look at President Lincoln and his relationship with President Benito Juarez of Mexico. I may have said this earlier, president at the same time, who was invaded by French troops of Napoleon III and Austrian Habsburgs, who were attempting to make Mexico into a colony. With President Lincoln's support, although during the actual period of the Civil War, the support was not that there were not American troops fighting with the Mexicans, but with Lincoln's support, Juarez defeated that European colonialist expedition. And then James G. Blaine, the man from Maine, as I said, a senator and first congressman, then senator from Maine, twice Secretary of State. Blaine was a pioneer of trade reciprocity, which now President Trump has introduced. He was, following John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln. His policy was to strengthen the sovereign independence of all the countries of the hemisphere. That the United States, was not yet a world power or the overarching world power as we became. But our policy, the policy we choose for the world, we're going to exemplify in our hemisphere. And that Blaine and McKinley did by trying to foster the development of republics throughout the hemisphere, mediate wars, spread peace and prosperity. This was McKinley's policy, and as many of you know, when McKinley was assassinated in 1901, he was speaking at a hemispheric exposition, the Western Hemisphere Exposition in Buffalo, New York. And this policy became Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. What you were taught in school, or certainly if you taught about it at all, what I was taught in school was that Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's uncle and previous president, had frequently sent the U.S. Marines to collect debts from our sister republics in Central and South America, which led Marine General Smedley Butler to say war is a racket. Believe he wrote after having done that all those times, believe he wrote a book with that title. And Franklin Roosevelt repudiated the policy of using the Marines to collect debts for the London and New York banks. And your school courses tell you that was his good neighbor policy. But in fact, it went much further than that. The reality was that in the period before World War II and then continuing into the war, Roosevelt did extensive economic planning for the various nations of the hemisphere, what would be needed to make them prosperous, independent, self-sufficient. He said, a prosperous neighbor makes you prosperous. Prosperous neighbors to the south make the United States prosperous, which is true. And among the things he accomplished in that good neighbor policy was to revolutionize, virtually refound the steel industry of Brazil, so that Brazil became a major steel maker in the world in cooperation with Roosevelt and the U.S. steel industry, which was involved in doing it, to the point that Brazil is still today, almost 100 years later, the number 10 world steel producer. But this was only, I mean, what Roosevelt intended for the world was something similar because the opportunity existed after World War II. I mean, the British Empire was on its knees. Britain was sustained by transfusions of money and everything else from the United States. The world, much of the world, especially Europe, was prostrate after World War II. And Roosevelt insisted that the colonies of that Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain must not be allowed to reoccupy the colonies which they had held before the war, which in many cases the Japanese had driven them out of. That instead, these must develop as modern states with using what he calls American methods rather than British 18th century methods. Roosevelt and Secretary Marshall, the Secretary of State Marshall, of course, was in office after Roosevelt. Marshall continued that policy that the British Empire must come to an end. And Marshall, at the State Department, strongly opposed the British schemes to partition India and thus leave the continent, when they left it, leave it in perpetual war, which, it has been much of the time since they left in 1947. So this was Roosevelt's plan for the post-World War II world. It failed because Roosevelt died early, and his successor, President Truman, who was a Wall Street pick who he hadn't wanted for vice president, took the cue of Winston Churchill, his Iron Curtain speech. The world was enveloped in a Cold War which Franklin Roosevelt thought could have been avoided, and he had definite intentions as to how he was going to avoid it. And well, much has happened since then, but we're now again at the point where a world of sovereign nation states is on the agenda, thanks to the revolution led by President Trump. A revolution which has created the circumstance once again for a world of sovereign nation states. And of course, the United Nations, which we began the show with President Trump addressing the United Nations in 2018. The United Nations was part of Roosevelt's plan, but not in the way it's been degenerated since, substantially taken over by the undead British Empire in many respects. Roosevelt intended the United Nations as part of that plan for a world of perfectly sovereign nation-state republics. So I hope that that's been helpful, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Unless you want to add something first, Bob, you may.
No, I think we should just proceed to the discussion.
Great. Okay, so If you'd like to join the discussion, raise your hand. You raise your hand by, there are some people have already raised their hand, which is good. You raise your hand by, if you're on a desktop or something, you press the raised hand icon at the bottom of the screen. And then I'll call on you, you'll unmute with the microphone item at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a smartphone, you would press *9 to raise your hand. I'll call on you and press *6 to unmute. So do line up for discussion. Yeah, we have a few people who already have. One of them is Susan. Susan, you want to unmute, say where you're calling from? There you go.
Yeah, this is actually Bruce.
Okay.
Calling from Leesburg, Virginia, the site of this last 3 days Democratic caucus, if anybody's interested in that. No, I think this is a great presentation. The thing that I'm really struck by, what the thread that really comes across, which I know you wanted to emphasize, is the intricate connection between the idea of a nation state and the individual leader personality who brings it into existence. In all your examples,
Yes.
the nation state is a nation, right? And it's a multitude of people, right? But it comes into existence and is able to sustain itself based on leadership of particular individuals who you named. And therefore, the enemies of the nation state attack the nation state by attacking the leaders who embody that nation state.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that also throughout the examples you gave with Joan of Arc,
Yes.
with Solen, and it's very clear with Trump. And of course, this is one of the things that Lyndon LaRouche emphasized in his critique of his expose of Hannah Arendt, who created the false idea of the authoritarian personality, which is, she claimed it was about Stalin and Hitler, but it was really an attack on Roosevelt and Lincoln. And you see this now, the way this is done by the globalist is to attack the personalities who are actually bringing into existence the sovereignty of the nation state, or represent that, not just in name, but in activity. You see it like, why demonize Putin?
Exactly.
Who clearly, if you demonize Putin, you're demonizing the idea that Russia is a nation state. If you raise as a hero someone like Zelensky, you're creating a false idea of a nation state, which doesn't exist. Ukraine is a nation state. We've been through all that, right? But if you attack Trump, or if you attack Roosevelt, as has been done since he died, or while he was alive, or Lincoln, and Trump correctly points out that Lincoln was, attacked as much as he was by the media, or as Bob presented in these classes on McKinley, the way McKinley was attacked and demonized after his assassination, and as he's being demonized now around Trump's idea of the tariffs. So I just thought that would be, I know you intended to bring that out, which is really just struck me, this intricate connection. So I just wanted to underline it.
Yeah, it's very well said. Absolutely true. Bob, you want to add anything on that?
I just,
Well,
I
go
think
ahead.
I just want to say it's very important for us to keep that in mind, because people get squeamish in defending the individual leaders, which is exactly what the attacks are designed to do. And so it's really good to point out that historical connection, that this is the way nation states operate.
Bob,
Well,
you was,
yeah,
yeah,
well, what I would just say is, uh, it sort of related to the point that Bruce is making, which is an important point, um, is that if you look, for instance, at the United States today, or Russia, or China, and you can say, well, there's things I don't like about Russia, or there's things I don't like about China. Okay, but put those complaints to one side. One of the things that these nations have in common, as well as, for instance, Mexico, is that they're presidential systems.
yes,
Uh, um, and a presidential system involves, to a certain degree, a centralization of executive power in the office of the president. And, Gouverneur Morris, one of the founding fathers of the United States, who, together with Alexander Hamilton, was really responsible at the Constitutional Convention in creating a strong U.S. presidency, a strong executive, um, uh, made the point, and he spoke on this at the convention, that as opposed to members of the House of Representatives or members of the Senate or other elected officials who represented certain segments of the population, that the president represented the entire people, that the president um, embodied in himself um, the commitment of the nation as a whole to the principles of the American Revolution. And if you look at the other hand, thinking of Hannah Arendt's idea of the authoritarian personality, on the other hand, if you look at uh, most of Europe, except for France, where it's gotten very perverted, but if you look at most of Europe and really a lot of other parts of the world, particularly in the former British colonies, what you have is a parliamentary system, which all really sort of find their roots in the British Parliament, which was the first of these parliamentary systems. And uh, there is no unified will of the people. I mean, there is, there really is no national sovereignty because there is not a government that exemplifies or represents the commitment to national sovereignty, the commitment to a national mission, which is what you find in the presidential system. If you look at Putin today, he is standing up for Russia. Um, Whereas if you look at Germany or some of these other countries in Europe, um, they're not standing up for their nations. There's no government that actually represents the common good of those nations. They're all members of parliamentary systems which by design are weak and are easily manipulated by the oligarchy. Um, so anyway, I thought I would just add that.
yeah. They can be. I mean, they can be swept away at any time by by a feather. Really, they're no longer the government. It's just, well, it just happened in Germany.